Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for attending this year's Honors Professor of the Year award ceremony and speech. My name is Colin, and I'm co-president of the Honors Student Association, the organization responsible for selecting the Honors Professor of the Year. I'm going to keep this fairly short and sweet since you all didn't come to hear me speak, and I'm not such a big fan of public speaking myself. The purpose of this event is going to be to honor, spoiler alert, Dr. John Kitchens. I know that some of you may be here in order to satisfy your requirements for your honors recitation. I know this is how I was whenever I came here in my freshman year. However, what you don't know is that you chose the best fireside chat to attend. Not to diminish any of the work any of the other honors professors have done this year, but you are in the presence of CSU's absolute best. Dr. John Kitchens is one of CSU's very own, earning his bachelor's in English here some years ago. We're very thankful that he's chosen to come back and teach here at CSU. Last year was a year like no other. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that, but in a time in which patience and understanding was a necessity, Dr. Kitchens was an exemplary model of these attributes. According to one of his former students, Dr. Kitchens provides thoughtful engagement and truly cares about his students. His responses to assignments express his consideration, compassion, insight, and wisdom. He's provided meaningful feedback regarding my own writing and is cultivating an environment of safety and growth. Another student said, John Kitchens has an innate ability to make everyone in his classroom feel welcome. He's open and sensitive about real-life topics, and his class was helpful not only in my own personal growth, but in putting my life into perspective. He's a very caring professor who caters to his students' needs. And the same student would then later go on to say that he understands what we were going through as honor students, the pressure and stress we put upon ourselves. He continually reminded us that we are worthy, and he's committed to our success not only in his class, but also in our personal lives. These comments made it very obvious to us, the Honors Student Association officers, that Dr. Kitchens is deserving of this award. What else can one ask for in an honors professor? I know that I can't think of much else. Unfortunately, I never took one of Dr. Kitchens' classes, meaning that I have to rely on what others say about him, and everything I've heard has been absolutely wonderful. This award is decided by students in order to recognize professors who are not only the best educators, hence their work within the honors program, but the professors who have the most positive influence on students' lives. When we get recommendations, such as those I mentioned before, it really helps us decide who receives this award. To the students, thank you for opening our eyes and showing us a little bit of an insight as to who these professors are, because without you, I may never have realized how great of a professor Dr. Kitchens is. To the professors and to you, Dr. Kitchens, thank you for being such positive influences in our lives, and thank you for always being so understanding and supportive of us students. With all this being said, it is my absolute honors, get it, like honors program, to introduce you all to Dr. John Kitchens.
Well, I'm glad you said some years ago that I was a student here without defining the actual number. So, to begin, this is a speech on light. And what I don't want to see is the blue light of your cell phones. So if you will please make sure that they are turned off and silent, as mine, we can begin. So to the students, faculty, and staff of the University Honors Program, family and friends, if they are present, I thank you for this award. I'm honored and humbled and maybe a little proud to be here, but the truth is that I would not be here if it were not for the support that I have from the Honors Program, but more importantly from you, the students. I know it is common and perhaps cliche for an educator to credit their students as their source of inspiration, but do not let that suggest that the sentiment is false. I assure you in my case, and I believe in most others, it is very true. And not only you as honor students, but your entire generation. You are far more sophisticated than we were, you are smarter, you are brighter, and you have a world of resources that many of us could not even imagine except for in the pages of a science fiction story. Now, if only you would get off Snapchat long enough to use those resources, we might be better. Of course, I'm mostly kidding, as I've been teaching here for more than a few years, and I've seen many of you come and go. And I've seen the work you produce and the achievements that so many of you claim while you were here, as well as after you leave. And that gives me inspiration and hope. And the fact that you could provide hope to a pessimist such as myself is an achievement far greater than most of you probably know. And this being largely a first-year audience, since most of you are required to be here, this is what many of you have to look forward to, and I have no doubt that you too will achieve a great deal while you are here at CSU, as well as wherever you go from here. So as part of my reward, I get to give you this lecture. So here's a lecture. Always brush your teeth. Get plenty of sleep. Get plenty of exercise. Always do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Always look twice before you cross the street. Always take the time to consider the situation of the other. Always share and be generous and supportive. And most important, and I will never forget this, never litter. So that's my lecture. We're done. Seems we still have a little time left. So instead of lecture you, let me share something with you. On the one hand, we live in very exciting times. But on the other hand, and I don't think it's just my pessimism that would lead me to say that we also live in very dark times. And I don't think I need to give you a list of reasons why these times feel a little more grim than generations past. Though to be sure, many generations in the past have felt this very same way. Regardless, I don't think it's hyperbolic to compare our times to what has traditionally been taught as the Dark Ages. What with all the disease and stupidity and meanness, that despite humanity's amazing intellectual progress, ignorance seems to be spreading. That even when good information is right at the tip of our fingers, and yet the Flat Earth Society is growing. But the truth is, the so-called Dark Ages were slightly more complicated than that, and so are the times we live in today. Following the fall of the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages generally referred to times that included pandemics, world unrest, political upheaval, and it has traditionally been taught as a time of ignorance and regression in humanity. Now, most historians today would wince at such a description, arguing it was far more complicated than that, and that such depictions betray a Roman-centric perspective, particularly that of Petrarch, who is credited with coining the phrase the Dark Ages, in contrast to the light of classic antiquity, and admitting some lapses in progress and a decrease in literacy. In actuality, there were numerous advancements in science and agriculture during this time period, and there were cases and places where literature, math, science, and philosophy flourished. So my first point is that though these may be dark times, it's more complicated than that. For one, if you just listen to the news or your social media feeds, then it's true the world can appear fairly dark. And to be sure, there are those that are heavily invested in making it appear darker than it actually is, usually with the intent to manipulate based on that fear that they generate. Whether their interests are to get you to buy something or to vote for someone, to do something or to do nothing, fear is perhaps the oldest tool of manipulation, and yet there is plenty to be afraid of out there. But I'm not here to frighten you. What I'd like to do today is to give you some advice on how to be a light in such dark times. And none of this, by the way, is my own advice, but only what I have borrowed from people far greater than me, because, as they say, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. So my first point is simple enough, but that doesn't mean it's easy to apply. And that is to remind ourselves to seek out the light as much as possible, even in the most mundane events. Indeed, perhaps even more so in the most mundane events. Again, sometimes it's the interest of others to make the world appear darker than it is. However, the light is there. Sometimes you have to look for it, but there is joy and laughter and wonder and love, just as there is pain and sorrow, and yes, there's an awful lot of bad going on in the world, but there's an awful lot of good too. Look for it, shine a light on it, celebrate it. And I do believe that recognizing is one essential step in becoming. But I will return to this idea momentarily. To begin, now that I guess we've actually begun, the title of my speech is a rephrasing of a quote that apparently Gandhi never said, but it is attributed to him, and you can find it ubiquitously stated all over the internet, but I have yet to see an actual source that references when and where he said it. Regardless, he did express a similar sentiment, and for those of you who don't know, he's often quoted as saying, "Be the change you seek in the world." But if you're like me, you've actually never really been satisfied with that quote. I mean, personally, I'd like to see a lot of freaking change. And when I think of all the change I'd like to see, then I often feel way too small to do, much less be the change or that scale of change. But in fact, that's one of the lies that those who manipulate fear want you to believe, that small change doesn't matter, that the matters of the world are so immense and awesome and terrible that the changes on the small scale remain insignificant. And I'm here to tell you that those changes are perhaps the most significant. I understand the desire to make a big splash, to change the world, but what can you do to help your roommate, your neighbor, your neighborhood? The phrase "think globally, act globally" did not originate as an environmentalist phrase, but a political one. And I would insist that this is how truly real change occurs, and even how big change starts. Greta Thunberg, for example, did not begin on the world stage she is on now, but she began by herself at her local school. There's a saying that's sometimes attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy, though it's actually a bit older and, frankly, less glamorous than that. Regardless, it says that it's far better to light a single candle than to curse the darkness. Much of our society rewards those who do the latter. Sadly, it seems like the most popular shows or sites on the media are often those that are based on those who can curse the darkness the louder, and whether their outrage is moral or fake, for the most part, they mostly serve to amplify the darkness and do nothing to bring in the light. I'm reminded of the lyrics of a rock and roll song where the singer claims he's going to kick the darkness until it bleeds daylight. I have to admit it's a powerful image, and there's an appeal to the violence that satisfies our moral outrage. But I'm not sure that's the metaphor we should be following. Instead, I might turn to Martin Luther King Jr., who says, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." And I think we can take this both literally and metaphorically, because if you think about it, you're not going to out-dark the dark. And perhaps you can take that from someone who has tried. Carl Sandburg once wrote that if he ever came across the tomb of Jonah, he would sit for a while, for he too has been swallowed by darkness and came out of it after all. I appreciate that quote deeply because I share the sentiment. And for those of you who don't get the reference, he's referring to Jonah from the Bible, who gets swallowed by the whale before being spit up on the shores of Nineveh, which was apparently his destiny. And I understand the darkness, and more importantly, I understand its appeal. I understand the temptation that there's something to learn from it, and believing that for a long time I did finally learn something. I learned that the only thing to be learned from the darkness is that there isn't anything to learn. And we're better off staying out of it. Now, that's not to say that bad things won't happen, that there will be sadness and sorrow, and there's no amount of wisdom or prayer that will prevent that. Robert Frost writes a poem entitled Acquainted with the Night, in which the narrator outwalks the furthest city light and looks down the saddest city lane, but accepts that the time the clock proclaimed as neither wrong nor right. Some things just are. But sometimes the light we have is a fire, the fire of indignation. When we look at the world and say, that's not right. And I understand that, actually pretty well. Sometimes it is our duty, our calling, or our responsibility to take what's done in the dark and bring it into the light. And sometimes we want to roar at the inequities of wealth, at the inequities of health, and at the disparities of power and privilege and poverty, and I think that's good. Indeed, I think we need more of that today. You know, it feels like there was a time when you turn on the light and the vermin would run for the shadows. We live in weird times. Now it feels like you turn on the light and they're like, yeah, what are you looking at? So while I firmly endorse the critical use of the light to expose the injustices around us, I would also warn, and again from very personal experience, to be wary of when that light turns red. And by this I am referring to seeing red, aka anger. Here I think it's worth listening to Seneca, who said that anger was temporary madness. What he means is at the moment when the passions take over reason. And unfortunately, in our society, anger is too often normalized, sometimes even valorized as an admirable quality among men, as a perfectly acceptable expression of masculinity, while anger in women has at least traditionally been pathologized as a mental weakness. Regardless, my advice for all of you is when you are seeing red, imagine it as a stoplight. Stop and breathe. One of the 10 perfections in Buddhism, and by far one that challenges me the most, is something called equanimity, which often refers to the control or balance of passion. This is the opposite of what we're describing when we describe someone as being blinded by anger, or blinded by love, or fear, or self-interest. It turns out humans are pretty easily blinded. However, do not interpret this as apathy or inaction or even the absence of passion. Just maintain the presence of reason. But I've spent too much time talking about darkness, and so let me now turn to the larger question of how do we walk in the light when we are in a world of dark? So first I would take us back to my first point, which was that it might be as simple as recognizing. That is, being mindful enough to see it as it does exist all around us. And by the way, I understand there will be days when you don't feel like being the light. When you're in a particularly bad mood, or when you don't feel like when you wake up on the dark side of the bed. In fact, you might have a very specific place in mind where I can stick that light, where it will not shine. So yes, there are days when you're grumpy or sick, and like I said, just woke up on the dark side of the bed. And maybe you just want to cover up under the blankets and huddle in that darkness until it passes, and that's fine. But eventually, when duty and responsibility drag you out from under the covers and force you to participate in the world, you might recall a quote by Edith Wharton, who said that there are two ways of spreading the light: to be the candle or to be the mirror that reflects it. And so on the days when it's so hard to authentically be the light, then maybe you can muster the strength to simply reflect it. And that's what I mean by recognizing it. So I'd like to discuss Plato. Some of you have taken my class before, and so you know that I love Plato's allegory of the cave. In this story, we are all born into darkness, prisoners in a cave, watching shadows on the wall and believing those shadows to be our reality. Becoming so swept up with the importance and meaning of those shadows, we never recognize that we're shackled, much less that we're in a cave, much less that there are people who are actually controlling the shadows that keep us distracted. And then the story of the prisoner who is released from the shackles, taken past the shadow makers and out of the cave and into the light, which is, of course, blinding and painful. But as they say, the truth hurts. But eventually the eyes adjust and the freed person basks in the glory of enlightenment. And then the enlightened returns into the cave to share the light with the other prisoners, but instead is met with scorn, ridicule, and threats. This reminds me of another man who once said, "I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will walk in the light." And look what happened to him. They crucified him, if you don't get that. So where am I going with it? Oh yeah, sorry. Sometimes being the light doesn't make you popular. It's not just misery that loves company, but so does anger and jealousy and darkness. Nobody likes a party pooper who drags us all down with inconvenient truths. But that's not the only similarity that Jesus' messages has to Plato's allegory. Written a few centuries before him, Jesus said to live in the world but not of it, which could be interpreted to mean to liberate yourself from the shadows of the cave and live in the truth of the light outside. And because of the unpopularity of these inconvenient truths, it also relates the idea how tempting it is to just actually remain in the dark, blissfully ignorant, as we say. That I have enough problems to deal with in my own little life than to take on the problems of the world. Simply not paying attention becomes all too easy. So there's another old allegory I'd like to share, this one from the subcontinent of India. It's the story of the blind man and the elephant, in which a group of blind men touches one part of the elephant and describes it as the whole thing. The one who touches the trunk thinks it's a slithering water creature. The one who touches the ear says it's a fidgety fan-like animal. And the one who touches the leg says it's more like the trunk of a tree, and so on and so on. The message that seems to be generally assigned to this story is to be humble before God. That God is so great that at the very best we could only understand parts of the whole. It's a very old story, and sometime around the 13th century, the Sufi mystic and poet Jalal ad-Din Rumi wrote his version, in which the men aren't actually blind, but instead each one holds a candle. They each go into the dark room containing the elephant, but they all go in one at a time. And the poem ends thus, that if each of us held a candle there, and if we went together, we could see it in its entirety. While I think this story still points to having humility before God, or any subject really, Rumi's twist suggests for us to have humility to our fellow human beings as well. And thus we should be willing to learn from others, learn from their light, learn from their light, as well as sharing our own. Another great thinker, and one most affectionately known as the Buddha, said, "Be a lamp unto yourselves. Hold fast to the truth as a lamp." Similar to the message of Plato and Jesus, here is the suggestion to not get caught up in the shadows. But if the message is to hold fast to truth, What then is the truth? Even in our age where good, reliable information is actually available at the touch of the hand, it seems harder than ever. While the truth is indeed out there, it is too often obscured by misinformation or just sheer distraction. Or maybe we just simply don't bother to look. For one, on a practical level, we can't always know the truth. We have to put our faith in others. For example, how many of you know how satellites keep their orbit around the Earth? Okay, some of you do. Well, I don't, but I still trust that my cell phone works. Social psychologists describe how all of us have to trust what they call our community of knowers, those that we put our faith in where we get our information, where we get our education. Having never been in space myself, I did make the George Soros list, Steve Bezos list or whatever. So having never been in space, I actually don't know that the world is not flat. I don't know that we're not living in some snow globe made by the aliens, that they shake it up every once in a while to give us a good weather change. But I trust that the scientists that have indoctrinated me in the science of the gravity of spherical objects. And so the rise of the Flat Earth Society might be mostly laughable to many of us. The rise of mis- and/or disinformation has never been more complicated or more dangerous. In fact, I would go so far as to say that disinformation poses the greatest threat to humanity in our modern era. Oh, but wait, I forgot. I didn't come here to scare you. I came here to talk about how to be a light. But you should know what's ahead of you. Nonetheless, you have all gotten this far, and with the honors and awards that you have, by being able and willing to discern fact from fiction, truth from fantasy, reality from delusion, and the light from the shadows. And may you continue doing that. May you shed more light to those around you and play your part in bringing people and knowledge out of the shadows. So I'm going to wrap up things here, but I'm going to mix my metaphors a bit. I'd like to introduce a story that I've most often seen attributed to the Cherokee about a grandfather who is bestowing the meaning of life to his grandson. The old man tells the boy that life is a battle between two wolves, a good wolf and a bad wolf. And after a few moments of contemplation, the grandson finally asks, well, which wolf wins? And we are rewarded, after a moment of silence, with the profound answer from the grandfather, the one you feed, boy, the one you feed. But to be honest, I might think that it's better described in plural, that there are many wolves at once. And there's another lesson here that I'm not sure if it's sourced, but let me tell you that one of your greatest challenges in life is to learn to distinguish between the wolves that are trying to eat you in your head and actual wolves that are trying to eat you. And if you don't get my point, the implication is that most of the wolves are in your head. And there are very few in reality. But we feed the wolves in our head. We feed the wolves of worry. We feed the wolves of fear and doubt, and they end up paralyzing us, dampening the light within, and disabling us from shining at our greatest potential. And sadly, most of those wolves are either completely imaginary or woefully exaggerated. The truth is that we tend to build up tremendous anxieties about situations in our life, anxieties that don't serve us well, but that will largely disappear once you begin determined action. Because you see, not long after you were born, your ego began to develop. And it had and has lots of wants and desires and drives, many of which have come into conflict with the world around you, or they succumb to it. And throughout all of that, your mind began forming patterns of thinking, and this is your brain being wired on how to think and respond to the stimuli of the world, firing synapses and forming pathways that become more ingrained over time. And you see those patterns of thinking become habits of thinking, and before you know it, you have yourself a personality. And that running monologue that runs through your head is suddenly taken for granted, unquestioned, and unrecognized for anything except its obvious existence. And I don't really think I'm admitting schizophrenia when I say that the running monologue in our head is really often made up of many voices instead of one, or many wolves. And in this sense, we should be mindful of our patterns of thinking because there might be some that you want to change. There might be some wolves that you'd like to eradicate or at least tame. Which wolves are you feeding? What thoughts or patterns of thoughts have you been feeding that perhaps aren't serving you, ones you'd be better served to starve out? Because that is the metaphor. It's the starving or the feeding. And perhaps, more importantly, which are the ones you do want to feed and nurture? Now, I'm really mixing metaphors here, but what are the specific habits of thinking that either prevent or enable you to shine with all your brilliance and glory? And so my final piece of advice to you is taking the Buddha's quote about being a lamp unto yourself slightly out of context. Hopefully Siddhartha will not be offended. That's the Buddha's name. You see, I know your ilk. You as honor students. I was there. My guess is some of you have said, perhaps even boasted, I am my own worst critic. Right? And there's definitely an element in our society that rewards this sort of tough love as a necessary quality of the self-made individual. And I agree there is a time to let the critics in our head speak and to scrutinize ourselves and our work. However, I'd like to propose that to be a light unto yourselves also means to be good to yourself. You see, Buddha eventually gave up rigid asceticism, and he chose the middle path instead. So take care of yourself, take care of your body and mind, and it's okay to listen to the voice of the critic, but are you also including the voice of the supportive friend, of the nurturing parent, of the diehard fan? Because, again, it's been said by many before me that the light shines from within. And it's both paramount and legitimate that you nurture your own light. And it may take a little time to fully discover that light. It may take practice and failure and experience to learn how it shines best and how best feed and fuel that. But that discovery is yours to be had, and I hope you enjoy the process as much as the result. You will have to decide for yourself what it means to walk in the light, what specific talents and skills and qualities you have to share with the world around you. What can you bring to the conversation or the situation that will shine most brightly and illuminate the people or the issues around you? So I will end with this final quote from Carl Jung, who said, "The sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being." Maybe. But I think that only actually describes survival. I think the purpose of human existence is to share the light with others, or to light the light within others. Because someone far wiser than me once said that the greatest currency you have in life is your impact on others. Not how much money you make or how many likes you get on Snapchat, but the effect that you have on real people in real time. So may you go forth and shine on.